Welcome back. We had a lovely treat that last session. Now it's your turn. I have 2 questions from the audience thus far. Remember, we are trying to alternate the questions. So if you could stand up when you have a question, and there are people with microphones that will come to you. I have 2 questions from women handed in. So maybe we could start with those, and then we'll wait in the middle for a man to have a question. This one comes from a woman. A year ago, I was deeply impressed by a Malaysian Muslim feminist who said that the text of the Quran is neutral. It's what's in our hearts that determines which verse they emphasize or we emphasize. There are verses which can be emphasized to bring liberation to women and to, this is Muslim woman as well. How would you describe what's in your heart that causes you to emphasize certain scriptures, and which scriptures in particular would they be?
Well, when it comes to what's in one's heart, one of my favorite observations come from Thomas Aquinas, who says the proper objects of the heart are truth and justice. And to me, that's very important. Notice he doesn't put truth in the head, but in our heart. And justice too. And that's what I thought I was hearing last night when I heard Anne speak, and the poets and others, that is he right? That the proper objects of the heart are truth and justice. So that which speaks to me of truth and justice is that which turns me on. And truth, both of those are very broad categories. But truth is about the truth of life, the truth that we have been gifted this amazing planet over 13.8 billion years, and we know it's full of wonder and beauty and amazing things, and clearly it's our job to respond with justice, that is, with living in harmony with other creatures and also with one another, passing on the beauty and the truth to other generations. You know, to me, it's not rocket science. But I do love that phrase, the proper objects of the heart are truth and justice. And I think that's what most appeals to me when I look in the scriptures. Mm-hmm. And common sense. and the realization that, humanity is capable of plenty of evil things, and the Bible is full of stories of evil things going on. So it's not as if it's Pollyannish, and it's about awakening that warrior energy, that prophetic energy, to stand up and to be courageous. I'd like to say a few words about courage. Can I do that?
Yes.
Because we can't be warriors, we can't be prophets without courage. Now, courage is 2 French words, cœur large, a big heart, a large heart. So how do we develop courage? Well, one way is to fall in love continuously, because when the heart is expanded and joyous, then courage is possible. But what I've learned in life is that I've never had a course in courage in university or seminary, Courage 101 or 202. So where do you go to learn courage? My experience is you go to courageous people. And I've had the privilege of meeting some, and I've met some here. Certainly Anne is a courageous person. My student, Dorothy Stang, how many of you know her story? Dorothy Stang, Sister Dorothy Stang, a sister of Notre Dame de Namur. Make a long story short, she was 42 years in the Amazon, serving the peasants there and the rainforest defenders. And she took a sabbatical in my program and went back, and 2 years later she was assassinated at 73 years of age. She's an eco-martyr. And she wrote that because her family wanted her back, they knew it was dangerous. She was a leader. She was a target. But she said, no, I must stay. I will not flee. She said, the death of the forest is the death of all of us here. And she was just a very beautiful woman, but when she went back, she had learned a lot of circle dancing from us and Hildegard had been, so she would lead these circles at midnight in the forest. Her brothers and her sister said she came back much more of a feminist, much more in her body, and all this made her more joyful. So the relationship between joy and justice, and you fill your heart up. That's what courage is filling the heart up so you can stand up when you have to. And another courageous person event I had, when I was silenced for a year, I went to the Amazon and lived for a week with Bishop Tasadalaga, very much a poet and mystic. And he had a retreat that weekend for church workers. And they had a simple mass in an auditorium, in a gymnasium. At the end of the mass, they were told, go up and light a candle and name 3 people you know personally who were tortured and killed. And afterwards, a guy came to me and said, the hard part was limiting it to 3. I know at least 10. These are ordinary people in jeans and T-shirts, and it just hit me like thunderbolt how much courage humans are capable of. We're carrying all this courage in us, but we don't know it, and we have to bring it out. And it comes out when we stand for something. And one other example I have of courage made is Fred Shuttlesworth. He was a black street minister who was king's man in Birmingham. He was not well educated. He was a street guy, but he was the leader of the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was called to do a dialogue with him on ecology and racism. And when he was in his later years, he moved into the whole ecology issue. And he himself was beaten 3 times by the Ku Klux Klan. His house was blown up with him in it. The whole roof caved in, and he walked out alive. And his 2 children, 8 and 10, were arrested by the sheriff. So before we went on stage to dialogue, I said, I have a question for you, Fred. I said, where do you get your courage? This is what he said. He said, you can call it courage, but I don't. I call it trust. That's really important, because that's the real meaning of faith. The word pistuane that we translate as go your way, your faith has saved you in the Gospels, actually means trust. Trust saves us. Trust makes us strong. Trust is at the basis of all courage. And Margaret alluded to this idea that faith is a pile of doctrines is extremely secondary. The real meaning of faith from Jesus' lips is trust. Trust heals. So those are 3 stories of courageous people that I've learned from, and 4 with Anne, what Anne's gone through. Do you know that the Ku Klux Klan burned her house down to the ground in this country of yours? Yes. And so, that's what courage is. It's trust.
Do we have another question from a man, transgender?
Good morning, afternoon. My sister's brother-in-law is a high up in the Vatican. I better not say which order, but I was chatting with him about you, and he told me that you've been rehabilitated.
That I've been what?
You've been rehabilitated.
Where? In the Vatican?
The Vatican, someone from the Vatican.
And
oh my goodness.
I asked him what he meant by that, and he said that he thought that the Catholic Church was becoming more closely aligned with your way of thinking about eco-theology. So I'm wondering if you'd care to comment on whether you think the institutional church is really interested in some of these ecological ideas.
Well, I think the Pope's encyclical Laudate Si on ecology confirms that. Clearly he's there. And he's also taken up a lot of the teachings of liberation theology and the criticism of Wall Street capitalism and extractive capitalism and so forth. When he wrote his encyclical, Rush Limbaugh, I don't know if you know Rush Limbaugh, you're not missing anything, but he's an extreme right-wing talk show nut in America with a huge following. He said, clearly the Pope is a Marxist. That's what he said about the Pope's encyclical. But yeah, I think that it's pretty obvious that the new paradigm, if you will, which is an ancient paradigm of creation theology, creation spirituality, is moving from the edges to center. But it's not going to save the Catholic Church as we know it. I think that it has to die. Our churches have to die. It's, you know, when Jesus talks in John's Gospel about the seed dying to be reborn, I don't think he's just talking about individuals. Our institutions, they come to a point when they're clearly out of touch. And wasn't it Jesus who said, "Let the dead bury the dead"? One of his strongest lines, really, a really strong line. And so I just think in the story I told the first night with my dialogue with Leonardo Balf, that the church is dying. It's dying in Latin America. It's dying in Europe. It's certainly dying in North America. And this latest book on the closet in the Vatican is another nail in that tomb. And I wrote a 9,000-word response to that book that is published by T. Kun magazine, but it's on my website as well. But so yeah, I feel I'm in dialogue with the Catholic tradition very much. My whole, you know, when I'm quoting all the time Aquinas and Eckhart and Hildegard, they were all in that tradition. But I feel that in many ways we're beyond denominational boxes today. There's a sociologist who's done a lot of work on postmodernism, and he says today we belong to so many communities at once that we should write ETC period after our names. So people say to me sometime, well, when you left the Catholic Church, blah, 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 and I said, I never left the Catholic Church. I didn't sign any papers, I'm out of here. I just became an Episcopalian too, and I'm other things as well. So that's the kind of time we're living in. So I draw from that tradition a lot of riches, but I don't at all agree with the way they treat women, or the way they treat sexuality in general, or homosexuality, etc. They're living, it's a Galileo case all over again. Science spoke in the 1970s about homosexuality, and what are these churches doing, hiding their head in the sand 50 years later? It's absurd. And it's splitting churches, all of them, down the middle. It's a total waste of energy. We should be fighting alongside indigenous people and others who care deeply about the earth and fighting for our children. So I'm not pounding on the door of the Vatican trying to get back in.
I have another question from a woman. She's wanting you to talk a little more about angels and dreams. You mentioned angels and dreams quite a bit. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes, I started trusting my dreams way back. My first book, the title came in a dream. I thought the title was going to be Spirituality American Style, and then this big musical, mystical, dancing bear came to me in a dream. So I called the book On Becoming a Musical, Mystical Bear, subtitle Spiritual American Style. Then the book came out, and I learned that the bear is the oldest form of worship in North America. Indigenous people worship the bear because it stands on two legs like a human, but it has all this power like God, healing powers and, physical powers, and, it's kind of strong and bossy. So it was really amazing to me. My dream was way ahead of my mind, which usually is the case. And so I try to listen to my dreams. And like when I was silenced for a year, and then I was going back to speak, a dream told me what to say. So it was at a conference of 2,500 people who called to action, which are kind of progressive Catholics in Chicago. And my opening line was, as I was saying 14 months ago, when I was so rudely interrupted, so I got two big laughs out of it. I mean, really big laughs. They laughed and laughed. And someone did an article on my talk, and it was only about that, right? I could have said whatever I wanted to say afterwards, because all they talked about was the big laughs and that opening sentence. But anyway, I learned to trust my dreams more than I trust institutions. And I learned that about 1970. So dreams are amazing, and I think we should all be trusting dreams. Now, angels do have a place in our dreams. That's one way that they get to us. As Aquinas says, angels learn only by intuition. So they don't have to have conferences, they don't write books, they don't go to school, they don't teach. Intuition is everything with them. So as we develop our intuition, which is our right brains, if you will, our mystical brains, we will find angels hitchhiking on that highway of intuition. We're going to have more angels in our life. Now, Lorna Byrne, B-Y-R-N-E, look her up, her webpage. She's a very credible, very poor Irish woman from the West Coast, who in fact is illiterate because she's dyslexic, in her 60s now, but she's had visits from angels since she was 2 years old. To make a long story short, I interviewed her at Grace Cathedral, and I hear it's on YouTube or something. 1,300 people showed up, Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and here's one of the things she said. She said, angels, there are a lot of unemployed angels on the earth today. And I said, oh no, I know all these unemployed people. You mean I have to put angels to work too? She said, no, this is a deal. God knows how much trouble humans are in and is pouring angels on earth to help us, and no one's asking them for help. So I think that we should ask angels for help when we go to bed at night, because they often like to visit us in our sleep and in our dreams, give us messages. Have a paper and pencil next to your bed so you can get the message and go back to sleep, because angels aren't real good at understanding how important sleep is to us. The same is true of making love. Sometimes you're making love and you hear wings flapping. That's angels. They're jealous. They're jealous. They can't do it. They can't do it. Hildegard of Bingen says that angels love to watch humans at work, at good work. So they praise us for our work. And so we have these relationships. So Rupert Sheldrake and I, a British scientist, and I did a book called The Physics of Angels a few years ago. And it's an important book that a scientist and a theologian is talking about angels today, because now that the roof has come off, the lid has come off a mechanical universe, angels are on the run again. And I'll tell you this, angels love to worship, but I think they're as bored as most two-legged ones at most worship, and they left church a long time ago. But we can bring them back. We've had angels for sure at our cosmic masses, for example. And this is an important test. And Lorna Byrne, she attended, we had a mass when she was in town, cosmic mass with the theme of the angels. And she said that there were more angels there than human beings at that mass. And they were floating up and down the altar like this and all this. So I do think that we have help from other places than just our governments and our man-made institutions. Now, some ancestors come as angels or spirits. Buck Gostor said to me one day, what you Christians call angels, we call spirits. So the spirits often show up when we need them, and we can call on them. You can get up in the morning and make a simple prayer to the 4 directions or the 7 directions and ask the angels from each direction to come to be with you during the day and to give you good advice through your intuition about decisions you have to make, about people you meet, and so forth. So don't underestimate the experience of angels. And people have it all the time, just like they have experience of these resurrection stories, but we don't talk about it. We keep it in. But in fact, people do have experiences of angels. How many people here have had experiences of angels? Do you think? Do you believe? Well, it happens. And it'll happen more if we call on them.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that was a question from a woman. Do we have the next question? Where's our microphones? Oh, there we, oh, I think we're up to a man. Sorry. I'll be in trouble otherwise.
Matthew, just James Donahue from Brisbane. Just interested when you were talking about your early life history, just meeting the Dominicans and the friends in the public school. At that time, did you have any idea what happened to some of the famous Dominicans like Meister Eckhart and Thomas Aquinas and Giordano Bruno? Like that, they got Giordano Bruno got burnt at the stake. Like when you joined the Dominicans, did you know? Do they sort of say this is what happens to some of us, or was it something unconscious? Was there like a warning?
I didn't get that. We're not getting that, hearing that.
It's not real
actually.
clear, I'm sorry.
Can you just give us a shorter
I
version?
already mentioned
and the
Bruno and Eckhart.
Matthew, when you were talking about your early life, when you were a teenager, you're meeting the Dominicans, like in the Dominican parish priest obviously was talking to you about things, and you got into Dominicans. But at that time, did you have any idea what happened to some of the other Dominicans, like Thomas Aquinas, who got excommunicated, Meister Eckhart, who gets silenced, and Giordano Bruno, who actually get burned at the stake? Like, at the time when you're sort of drawing into the Dominicans, did you know that was what happened to some of them? Or was it something that was totally unconscious?
Did you get that?
Yeah. Well, Aquinas wasn't excommunicated. He was condemned after he died by 3 bishops in Oxford and Paris. But no, I'd never heard of Meister Eckhart. Even after all my training as Dominican, his name was never used once. Not once in all my training as Dominican. So I discovered him, on my own, if you will, or later. But and Giordano Bruno I'd never heard of in my Dominican training. But it was enough to kind of read Jesus' life to know that things don't always end well with prophets. And so, and then of course in my own lifetime, we've seen so many martyrs in South America, for example. And of course Thomas Merton, too. So, one gets over one's naivete after a while. And of course, in my coming of age in the 60s, there was a civil rights movement, and of course, the murder of Malcolm X, and the murder of Dr. King, and the murder of Kennedy's brothers. And so, there was kind of a getting over of naivete, I think, that when you, in the 3 young men, seminarians, 1 Jewish, 1 Christian, so forth, who were murdered in the South during the segregation, during the civil rights movement. I mean, you began, as you get older, you realize that taking a stand is costly. It's like Anne was saying, quoted Bonhoeffer, that, grace doesn't come cheap. And so this is why we need that courage. And that's why I've always been attracted, I think, to courageous movements and people and those who stood up to be counted. And we call these, eventually we call them saints. Often when they're around, we think they're troublemakers. But the truth is that as Gandhi said, if you want to work for justice, prepare yourself for mountains of suffering. And that's not a masochistic statement, it's kind of a political statement. It's a rough road. And so all the more reason to fill up on the via positiva. You want to learn joy, you want to learn fun. It's one of the things I like about young people today, that fun is a virtue for them. Even though they're facing dire apocalyptic news, they know how to have fun. A lot of them do anyway. And so the play and the process and the joy must be part of the journey. And if it ends abruptly, it ends abruptly. But meanwhile, you tell your truth with allies, and you stand up for justice and for joy. Because really, to me, what justice means is the sharing of the joy and making joy possible for one another. And so the process must be part of the focus. Meister Eckhart and other Buddhists, though he was a Dominican, he said we must, until you learn to live without a Y, W-H-Y, and to love without a Y, and to work without a Y. You haven't heard how to live, how to love, how to work, or why. He says we do justice to do justice, not to win every battle. You love in order to love. And one day, it was a Sunday, hot Sunday in August, which in our country is hot, and I was going swimming with 3 friends. And 5 minutes into the swim, one of my friends lost his teeth, went fluttering down to the bottom of a brown lake. We spent the next hour, the 3 of us, diving for those teeth. We never found them. But the next day I was teaching Eckhart in a summer program, and that quote was in the reading for the day. Live without a Y, love without a Y, work without a Y. And I realized we had introduced a Y into swimming. Because when I came out of the lake after an hour, I wasn't refreshed. But I'd done everything you do in water in the summertime. I got wet and I didn't drown. But I wasn't refreshed. And I realized what a radical teaching that is from Eckhart and why no one tells us about it in a capitalist country. That play is radical. And working without a Y is radical. And this is a very Buddhist teaching, but it's also deep in one of our deepest mystics and prophets, Meister Eckhart. So that was a big awakening for me. That to introduce teeth into a swim thing kills the day. Besides, my friend lost $5,500 worth of teeth.
Oh, yes.
But I got an insight into teaching something.
Do we have another question? Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah. So in the time of moving from the Anthropocene, this question is about why does it matter if, for example, the southern black-throated finch may go extinct because of the Adani coal mine in the Galilee Basin, because that's where they're putting its mine. It's already extinct in New South Wales, and they have now found a small population where the coal mine is going to go. So why does it matter if that bird goes extinct?
We've got a coal mine that's going to make a bird extinct species. Why does it matter?
Well, any coal mine matters at this time in history because it's contributing grossly to the climate change and to carbon dioxide being released. So even irrespective of a particular species of bird. But your question is an interesting one about the survival of species. And, over the millions of species have gone extinct in our lifetime. And it matters if we care about other beings. Meister Eckhart talks about our friendship with other beings. And the Lakota people talk about all our relations, including relation with a particular bird. Do beings other than humans have rights? And yes, they do. They were here longer than us. And they've blessed us. They share their songs with us, the birds do. And they sing to us. And of course, they give us beauty and the rest. But they have their job too, to be this bird and to give birth to new people, new birds like them, etc. So it's really about arrogance. Does arrogance win that we are the only species that matters? Or does a respect for the diversity of our home, the earth, does that matter? So I think real value questions come up in your question. But I do think the first part of my answer is very important, that why does coal matter? Coal-firing energy system, because we've been too lazy to develop alternative forms now that we know how dangerous it is? I think that's the first question. But the second question is, where does our arrogance stop? and our sense of friendship with other creatures, and respect and reverence and gratitude for their grace, for their beauty. Where does that begin?
Can I just add on to that, or
Yeah,
not add on to it,
please
but
do.
ask another question? There are so many issues and things we have to care about, aren't there? For example, many of us drove here, many of us flew here. Should we not have stayed at home in terms of the environment? About eating meat as vegan or vegans, that whole issue about animals and the land. What do you find as your guidelines, or does it just happen, as to what things you care about? Because we can't care about everything, can we? What things do you care about, and how can we stop being a bit self-righteous about our caring?
Self-righteous on the one hand, or wallowing in guilt on the other, which freezes us, and therefore nothing will change. So there are those extremes. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I flew all this way, and you can check what the carbon footprint was on that, and it's pretty great to come this distance and back. So we do have to make these decisions, but we can't just fall into some kind of orthodox purity thing and say, well, let's stop living, or let's stop talking to each other, or exchanging one another's worlds and wisdom and the rest. So obviously there are compromises to be made. But that's where I think something like the Four Paths really helps us, because it gives us priorities. For example, the Via Creativa. When I was on this island with 150 scientists 2 summers ago, and the theme was climate change, I think I pointed out that despair was the mood for the first few days. But by the end of the week, 2 young scientists stood up, and one of them said that from information we now have, we could build an island off of North America, and it would be all wind turbines, and we could provide all the electricity for all the needs of North America. No more coal, no more oil, no more gas. So creativity is there, and but I think it has to be couched in a spiritual context, so that we're not being driven by fear or by despair or by one-upmanship. So I think we kind of have to examine our motives in these decisions we make. And I would love that more and more people become vegan. I'm not sure I can do it at my age, and with health issues and stuff. I gave up beef 25 years ago. That I did, and I'm glad I did. But I can certainly eat less meat than I'm eating, and maybe I become vegetarian. So I'm kind of working on that, thinking about that. But so there's a spectrum here that all of us can work with. I think that young people are in a better position, even physically, to take on a pathway, say, of vegan and also vegetarian, and in the process to instruct us older people about how to do it well, how to have interesting meals that are vegan and vegetable or vegetarian and all that. So again, it's intergenerational wisdom. We can learn from those who have kind of sought this path earlier in their life. And so I just think we have to keep our common sense about us, and that when I got an invitation to come to Australia, I thought about that. I thought about the long trip, and I thought about carbon footprint. But I also thought, well, something interesting is happening here, and I might learn something from all these Australians.
I'm glad you did.
I did, yeah. I'm glad I did too.
Yeah. Another question? I think John's had his hand up. I think.
John Corriple. Can the church, its existing denominations, truly embrace creation spirituality again, emphasis on again, or can't the old wineskins contain new/old wine without breaking? Do we need new structures which are more universal beyond our traditions, interfaith, to develop this line of thought?
Well, I think that interfaith is here to stay, and it's a very positive thing because no one path holds all the answers, and we have so much to learn from each other, and by getting together to create third ways and processes. You know, the Dalai Lama says the number one obstacle to interfaith is a bad relationship with one's own faith tradition. That's very important. And you see, if our version of Christianity does not include mysticism, then we're just fulfilling the Dalai Lama's prophecy. That's the deeper part of our faith, and the prophetic tradition. And William Hawking, the early 20th century American philosopher, said, the prophet is a mystic in action. So it's those first two paths we talked about, and then path 3 and 4. They go together as a package. So we got to know that stuff. Otherwise, we're set up for all kind of religious idolatry. Religious idolatry. Whether it's a Bibleolatry or Christolatry, all these idols that we manufacture in the name of religion and so forth. So keeping a critical mind, a critical eye, and standing up about bogus religion and bogus Christianity. For example, I'm not even sure that it's worth keeping the name Christianity. In the Middle Ages, there was something very similar. When the feudal system broke down, and with it the monastic theology in the 12th century, in the late 12th century, there was a big discussion because what had developed was a word called Christianitas, meaning Christendom. Christendom. And Christendom was all wrapped up with the shadow side of the Middle Ages. So the reformers, that is Francis and Dominic and all the communes from which they were born, they refused to use the word Christendom. They dropped the word from their vocabulary because it was so full of skeletons in the closet, they wanted nothing to do with it. I think it's a very parallel situation today. That Christianity, the name, has been hijacked by so many pseudo-Christian movements, fascist movement, Christo-fascist movements, that I think one could make a very good argument that we can't even run with the word Christianity. I prefer the word Christ path, for example, which does go back to the early church. And so I think even there we need poets, and we need to play with new language, because the word Christianity, at least in the media in my country, usually means very far right-wing conservatives with lots of money behind them, because right-wing movements want to put money behind the right-wing Christian movements. So I think that's the kind of time we're living in. But, you know, it's a marvelous time to be alive. I mean, everything is asking to be reborn. Everything, not just religion, not just the churches. Education, economics. And we have some answers. I mean, I just love the work of David Corton, for example. He spent his whole life really developing economics that works for everybody. And by everybody, I don't mean just all the two-legged ones. He's done his study of cosmology and ecology, and a good economics will work for the trees, and will work for the birds and the frogs and the whales and everything else. It's possible. We are capable of that as human beings. That's how brilliant we are. Here's a story that a scientist taught me. When we humans left Africa, maybe 65,000 years ago or so, and we invented fire, discovered fire, we brought that with us. And then when we landed in what is today Eurasia, the Ice Age broke out. The Ice Age began. Now, imagine that we'd come from the savannas of Africa, and the Ice Age breaks out. Well, I'm sure the first 1,000 years, people were blaming one another, who turned off the lights, you know, and the heat. But meanwhile, our ancestors, they hustled. They hustled to learn how to kill a woolly mammoth, to wear those clothes, to stay warm, etc. They survived. They didn't sit around feeling sorry for themselves and excommunicating one another, they got down to the job at hand, which was survival. And that's where we are today. That's what's so amazing about this moment. There's this wonderful teaching in Howard Thurman, one of the greatest mystics in North America. He was a spiritual genius behind the civil rights movement. He and his wife came to India in 1935 and brought Gandhi's teachings back to America. A very holy man. And many times he used this one phrase about being stripped to our literal substance of ourselves before God. That's what religion is really about. And he says that's why God doesn't care what religion you are. What we care is being stripped to the literal substance of ourselves before God. You can call it the true self. You can call it your Christ self or your Buddha self. Call it what you will. But that's what we're undergoing today. This is the dark night of our species. And that's why I tried to talk the other night about what does it really mean to be human? We're being stripped to the literal substance of itself to be human. And that's what happened at the Ice Age. And it's happening now. So we have to throw off patriarchy because patriarchy is full of self-pity. It's always full of self-pity because it kills the mother principle inside culture, and inside both men and women. And therefore, there's no compassion. So you're wallowing in self-pity because you're not getting that compassion dimension. So we have to resist temptations to self-pity and get on with the task at hand. And that's what I love about what you're doing regarding the Aboriginal movement in this country. You're talking about action. Action. And of course, statements aren't enough, as Anne emphasized yesterday. What actions come next? But they must come out of a deep place, not a place of fear and guilt. No, deeper than that. A place of sorrow, yes, but a place of wisdom and love and compassion, because that's the depths of our human capacities. And this is why every spiritual teacher I know about talks about compassion. The Quran, the most common name for Allah is Allah the Compassionate One. And Buddhists and Jesus, be you compassionate as created in heaven is compassionate. And Jeremiah and Isaiah and the rest. So this is where we go deep. And it's so exciting that why have we been chosen, this generation, from the young to the old, to the elders, why have we been chosen to carry this possibility forward that we call the human species? Because if we're successful, we will be making an evolutionary leap. Humanity will not be the same as we were in the age of dualism. We will make an evolutionary leap. And even if we fail, we will have failed at something worthwhile.
Wonderful. Some questions. Where are our microphones? There's some questions here, right?
Hi, it's John Percy. This has been a wonderful conference. It's given us, it's certainly given me, words to speak and I could use in the future. But I look around and with some welcome exceptions, it's my generation. And I wonder if we're relics that will pass away. I feel that I haven't been able to pass on spirituality to the next generation. My two sons, they've got a lot of good things, but not a spirituality that I can identify. So what can we do for the next generation that isn't here with us?
Well, I think one thing we need to do is to create new forms the previous question I think touched on that, where the sharing of leadership is broader and also evolutionary. So, for example, the young man, Skylar Wilson, who's director of our Cosmic Mass, he doesn't identify as Christian. He says, my church is the wilderness. He was healed by the wilderness as a boy, well, he was 11 or 12. When his parents got divorced, he was very broken up by that, and his uncle took him to Canada for a month canoe trip. And that was his healing. And what he does for a living, if you will, he does rites of passage with teenagers in the wilderness, and then also vision quest with adults in the wilderness. But he loves the Mass because his grandmother was a Sufi, and she taught him the value of ritual. And so he's very committed. But so I have to, as an elder, I have to accept him on his terms. But even he, at some of our Masses, has had experience of Jesus showing up, which happens frequently in our Masses. Like when we did it at World Parliament in Toronto in November. He and I both had the experience of Jesus showing up during the same song that all of us were singing. And there were Buddhists there and all kinds of traditions there. But my point is, we have to really listen to the younger generation and invite them to leadership. So this is why, like the Order of the Sacred Earth, we have two young people as the directors and the leaders. I'm just kind of in the background as an elder. And, our culture is very slow to turn things over to young people. But I think as we get more and more desperate, we're going to realize the wisdom that's there. And they're not married, you see, to the former stories and the former structures, so they are freer to try new forms and structures. So I think our first job is to listen and then work things out together. So even meetings like this, first of all, they cost money, and young people often don't have money today. They have college debts instead, and they can't even look forward to buying a home, etc. So, they're undergoing a lot of things. But I think a lot of young people are very alert to the ecological crisis. This affects them directly. And so this is common ground. And I think that we should be kind of advertising, if you will, as elders, those who are elders, to, for example, put word out there that we'll have a circle meeting some night of the week, elders and young people to talk together about whatever, no agenda. But get together and then listen to what's on their minds and what their values are and what they're struggling with. I think that's where it begins, is communication. And then eventually ask them what kind of a conference would be of interest to them. Now, many of them will say, well, a conference online, because I can't afford to travel, etc. Okay, that's possible too. So, I wouldn't give up. And of course, they create their own rituals, many of them around concerts and around music and the arts. And that should be acknowledged. And also sports. Those sports can get a little crazy. But sports, too, really are an attempt by humans to calm the reptilian brain. I think it's genius on our part, frankly, that we acknowledge, and by we I mean all our ancestors. I don't know any tribe that doesn't have sports. Think about, say, a basketball court. It's got a parameter, you've got an umpire and rules, you've got a time watch, but then you pit two teams of reptiles against each other, and in the stands there are reptiles too, wanting to win and beat up and become number one. It's really genius. It's much better than going to war. And it brings out the excellence of people who want to indulge in such kind of gladiator moments. And but we have to kind of critique it too. When it's just about making billionaires crazier and richer, that's poisoning what real sport is. But my point is that there are many ways, including that humans have developed to calm our reptilian brain. Meditation is surely one of them. But even sports is. And so I think we can connect on some common ground like that. But meanwhile, I think young people will learn a lot of the, the tragedies of life and the joys of life along the way. We want to support them in any way we can in that regard. But, St. Benedict in the 5th century, in his monastic rule, he has an amazing passage where he says, when there are the most important questions to decide in the community, we must call on the youngest one in the community first, because the Holy Spirit speaks first to the youngest ones. That is important. That is important, and it's common sense. They are not as committed to the current structures. Therefore, they are freer. And of course, others who aren't committed, like women who have not been brought into all the decision-making in places, they bring a fresh look too. But the very fact, we have to admit that adultism is as much a crime as sexism and racism and homophobia and the rest. And what adultism is this: it's repression of the child in the adult. So when young people demonstrate their freedom or their spontaneity or a sense of fun, our repression of the child comes up as oppression onto them. And it's unconscious and therefore very dangerous. But that's where the mystic comes in. The mystic is the divine child in us. Why is the Christ called a lamb and not a sheep? Because sheep, they've seen it all. They've seen it all. I was in Britain once during springtime, and we went out to the moor, and there were these little sheep jumping up on little lambs jumping up on mama sheep, trying to get them to play. Mama sheep was in no playing mood. So to play again, that's the mystic in you, and that's the artist in you. Jung says there's no creativity without play and fantasy. So at that level of play, the level of art, there's absolute common ground between the young and the old. And so I think we have to look that way. And it's important that the Christ was called the Lamb of God, not the sheep of God. He was not an old, tired senex.
Well, I think we have used our time, unfortunately, and for Australians to finish with sport and sheep, you've done pretty well.
Lambs.
Oh, sorry, lambs. We're lambs. Anyway, thank you, Matthew. This has been an absolute treat. So let's thank you.
Good being with you all. Appreciate your... May you all flourish as the mystics and prophets that you are. And may you resolve this aboriginal blotch that is on all of our history. And I'll try to do something about it back at home also, about our blotches in North America. We got a lot of them in high places.